Hey everyone, Steven Pinker presents hundreds of pages of evidence that life is better today than it ever has been in history. So now it probably feels dumb to complain about egg prices, huh? Your biggest problem used to be dying at 27 of old age. Today's book is Enlightenment Now.
And this is the Book Pile.
I'm Kellen Erskine. I'm a comic, a father, and compared to most of history, living on borrowed time.
And I'm David Vance. I'm thinking of one day doing a political comedy show, so I keep a list of topics to cover. And the worst thing about me is that sometimes a social issue gets solved, and I feel slight disappointment that I didn't get to do an episode about it.
I'm just imagining you jumping out of your easy chair, throwing a newspaper to the ground, going, "Great, now that's been eradicated?"
There goes my chimney sweep maltreatment episode. All right, just like every week, check out this episode on our YouTube channel, link in bio. We'd love to hear what you think.
Also, feel free to leave us a rating and review on your favorite podcast app, especially if it's Apple Podcasts.
We do admire the people who said, Spotify doesn't let me leave a review, so here's me emailing you my compliments.
Crustless PBJ says, oh man. Well, they've already said that they're 9 years old. The Book Pile is one of my favorite podcasts, second only to Reason and Nonsense, which is hosted by three of my friends. I don't care, Mr. Sandwich. I already loved Kellen and his dry bar comedy specials. All right, Dave, so now he's winning me back. So enjoying this was a no-brainer. You're the best, parentheses, or slightly second best, I guess. Oh man, PBJ, you were so close.
There are 5 million podcasts in the world.
Oh.
You're in their top 2. They're telling you you are 99.9999th percentile. Should they frame it like that?
Let me put it this way, Dave. Would you like it if your girlfriend said, "You're my second favorite boyfriend"?
Every listener is your boyfriend?
Okay, obviously you and I are on different pages. Dave doesn't know how podcasts work.
If your podcast audience is meeting all the same emotional needs that your wife is meeting, there's something wrong either with your podcast or your marriage.
Or they're both thriving in a way you'll never understand.
Finally, our next book is The Tragedy of Hamlet. If you have an English test coming up, here's a little hint. The answer was, or not to be.
So I listen to Enlightenment Now because Dave brings it up every once in a while. It really has given me an overall peace of mind about the world, and not like a naive sense of optimism, but more just a piece about the fact that we are provably doing better than we ever have. If we're measuring societal progress by the decrease of mass human suffering and death, which is usually the barometer that I use in my own home, it helped me take an even bigger step back from the news, which would have you believe that the world is constantly on fire and that things are only getting worse, when the truth, the statistical truth is that, yeah, things aren't perfect, but it's also the best time ever to be alive. If you're looking for a time in the history of the world in which you'd like to have the best chance of not suffering from poverty, disease, early death, enslavement, or falling in a cesspool at night because your outdoor candle blew out. This book is split into 3 parts, and pretty much all my favorite stuff just comes from part 2. To me, part 1 has a lot of pseudo-philosophy that bored me, as he took 200 pages to explain what enlightenment means. Part 2 is by far the most valuable section, again, for me. It's just rich with statistical data. And then part 3 goes into more subjective territory of the future, where he's basically like, hey, don't worry about nukes because everything is getting better. And it's like, sure, don't live your whole life scared of World War III, but also, Mr. Pinker, just because the world has less disease and starvation doesn't mean that at some point one idiot with a red button isn't going to push it.
Sure. Especially when there's so many idiots with red buttons.
Yeah.
I know I've said this before, but if you were building a dream team of who you would give the nuclear codes to, would you ever be like, okay, so Kim Jong-un... I also really enjoyed this book. I do think it gives a lot of reasons for optimism about things like life expectancy and equal rights and other areas that I think are getting better. I do think there are some legitimate critiques, like you mentioned, Kellen, that we'll get into later. But I have friends who say, how can the world be getting better if there's so much starvation and disease and violence? And my current theory is it's because the world is kind of like the LA Clippers. It is both full of suffering and somehow used to be way worse. Oh, also a little preface before we get into this one. This book is over 400 pages long. It has more than 1,200 citations and is literally about all 8 billion people in the world. So I just want to say up top, this is the episode where we got everything right. So you can quote us. You can sue us if we're wrong. We're not. Big congratulations to the book pile today.
All right, and without further ado, here are 4 lessons that we took from Enlightenment Now. All right, lesson 1. We don't talk enough about the stuff that doesn't happen. So take a second to picture your favorite news outlet. Did you imagine an empty void like me?
I mean, I genuinely couldn't think of what my favorite is.
They're doing what they do to make money. And as the comedian Dimitri Martin says, the news should just be called bad news. So Pinker makes the claim that it's a mistake to generalize the state of the world or country or state or even your city just off of one news story. I recently brought up how I've met people all over the US who think that all of San Francisco's sidewalks are carpeted with human feces. When the fact is, I was there a month ago, and the real story is that there is a small 3-block square of San Francisco that has always had issues, and it still does. The rest of it is fine. It's stupid expensive, but you can walk down the wharf and get a bread bowl of clam chowder without hopscotching around people poop.
But what a fun game.
The point is, and the problem is, as Pinker points out in this book, we don't take no news in an area as good news.
Yeah.
Like, the more accurate story on Fox News would have been, hey, check it out, 99% of San Francisco is not human crap. And due to better building codes, they also haven't suffered a major fire in 117 years.
Yeah.
That's never the story, even though that is a significant story.
But even the way you frame that, I understand why the business model works the way it does.
Sure.
Because if I saw an article that said, most people yesterday weren't eaten by a beaver, I'd be like, go on. I'd be like, I have a big question now about the one person not in your story.
And the problem going along with that example is that the moment that 2 people are eaten by beavers, all of a sudden world headlines are beavers are eating everyone.
Yeah. Beaver murders up infinity%.
You thought COVID was bad. These little buggers don't wear masks.
Except the ones they made from human faces.
I imagine that in this story, patient 0 was a pirate and the beaver just worked its way up from the peg.
It would really make Narnia hit a little different, doesn't it? Edmund runs to the queen, spattered in blood, like, please, my siblings.
It's just filled with more like terrible B-movie lines. Mr. Beaver's like, hello, children. You look damn tasty.
He eats their foreign exchange friend Ahmet and calls him Turkish Delight.
I just want this to be the rest of the podcast.
Yeah.
So, of all this, Pinker writes, you never see a journalist on camera say, I'm on location in a country where a war has not broken out, or a city that has not been bombed.
Yeah.
And he continues, make a list of all the worst things that are happening anywhere on the planet this week, and you have an impressive sounding case that civilization has never faced greater peril. But the real numbers are that even with, douchebags like Putin, as a globe, we've never had this much peacetime.
Yeah.
And each subsequent decade since World War II has enjoyed collectively less war and genocide, and that is not something that we should ignore.
Right.
The one argument for anyone who accepts that less death is happening is often, sure, but all these statistics don't mean anything to the person who died. And Pinker says to that, true, but they do mean that you're less likely to be a victim for the same reason that they mean to millions of people who are not victims but would have been if rates of violence had stayed the same.
Right.
Homicide has gone down by arguably 4,000% since the Middle Ages.
Wow.
Most of history was just an insane time to be alive. And of course, it's not to say that the next violent spree isn't a massive tragedy. Like,
Right.
I don't want anyone to get the message that we're downplaying anything. I just think we need to stop equating singular events with the idea that everything is getting worse. Life expectancy continues to increase, not decrease. And that means something. Though I'm not going to be happy until the immortality rate increases. I'm kidding. I've collected enough Horcruxes. So in almost every year from 1992 to 2015, an era when violent crime plummeted in the United States, the majority of Americans told pollsters that crime was rising based on nothing but their feelings. So here's the real headline. Just because you feel something doesn't make it true.
Sure.
Just to double down on this, because I'm so tired of hearing that the world is coming to an end every time the headlines are extra bad. A typical headline nowadays goes something like this. Today, Congress voted on something you don't agree with. Now here's a typical headline from the year 1348. Today, 40% of your village died from a disease with no cure, so if you're alive, congrats, you get to continue selling what you own to pay taxes to a king you didn't choose, and also he hates you.
I'm so impressed that the newspaper staff got that out with everyone dying.
Imagine that kid on a bicycle with his paper route. He's just flinging newspapers at corpses. So my takeaway is, yes, the world still sucks, but all these numbers prove that the average person is much safer than any time in history. While Fox and CNN would have you believe that you have never been in more danger,
Sure.
and it just isn't true. 3 bad things in the news doesn't mean the whole world is going to hell.
All right, lesson 2. There are big ways in which life in the world has gotten a lot better. He goes into so many categories of improvement, and a big one, like you said, Kellen, is life expectancy. Here's a quote. Since the late 18th century, life expectancy across the world has risen from 30 to 71, and in the more fortunate countries to 81. Isn't that wild? Life is one of those huge things almost everyone wants more of, and we've been around like 200,000 years, and then in the last 250, life just doubled. In some places, almost tripled. Kellen, can you imagine that with anything else you care about? Imagine you suddenly had triple the kids. Pretty nice, right? Huh? And yet we don't talk about it very much. We act like life is getting worse because of, there's bullying. And don't get me wrong, bullying is bad, but you know what's worse is being dead by 30. If the book pile was made in the 1700s, on average, both of your hosts would be dead. And I've seen some people kind of dismiss the life expectancy thing. Like, well, a lot of that is just cutting down infant mortality. Like, what? Okay, so aren't you glad that's down? Yeah. When I see a firefighter come out of a burning building, I always say, I hope you didn't save the babies. He has a quote from Johan Norberg. Life expectancy in Kenya increased by almost 10 years between 2003 and 2013. After having lived, loved, and struggled for a whole decade, the average person in Kenya had not lost a single year of their remaining lifetime. Everyone got 10 years older, yet death had not come a step closer. Isn't that wild?
Yeah, and just that's such a beautiful way to put it.
If I were president of a country, I would just keep doing that. I'd pass a law increasing life expectancy. It's a law, right? The main way I would stop US deaths is if you're on your deathbed, I put you on a bus to Canada. And as a bonus, it makes Canada's stats worse. The Canadian Minister of Health is like, somehow for every 10 citizens, 12 died.
And then they'd have to change their national anthem to "Oh Canada."
Anyway, there's this cool study Pinker mentions. It lists 100 scientists who developed things like the measles vaccine and penicillin, and the study estimates those 100 scientists saved 5 billion lives.
Cool.
Isn't that just unfathomable? Kellen, to put that in perspective, imagine you had 5 billion kids. Huh? Pretty nice. Anyway, these stats are why, like I've mentioned before, if you think the world is getting a lot worse, I think you have to do two things. One, you have to pick a year you would have rather been born, just randomly assigned to anyone on Earth. And two, you have to let me, Dave Vance, grill you about all the horrible things happening right then. And if you're a historian who knows way more than me about a certain era, I get to punch you in the face.
All right. Lesson 3. Some progress is invisible. That's what I tell my parole officer. So Pinker writes, humanity's conquest over everyday danger is a peculiarly unappreciated form of progress. Though accidents kill more people than wars, we seldom see them through a moral lens. So some numbers to back that up. Compared to 200 years ago, you are 37 times less likely to be killed by a bolt of lightning.
Wow.
And that mostly includes like its side effects, like burning building, because otherwise that paints an insane picture of how lightning just used to be very person specific.
Maybe it's because we stopped believing in Zeus.
You're 5 times less likely to die from a fall because now it's required of infrastructure to have railings and ramps, plus tripping hazards like steps and curbs are painted in bright colors. True story. I went to Petco with my kids 2 days ago and tripped over one of those fold-up slippery when wet signs.
No, you're kidding.
No, yeah, it's been crazy wet in California with all these storms. And yeah, it was lying flat on the ground, presumably from someone else who had fallen. But the point of this is that I didn't fall all the way down because it's the 21st century. According to the National Safety Council, horses and horse accidents killed 10 times more people in 1900 than cars do now. Wow. It's probably because they didn't have very strict no text and bucking bronco regulation.
Yeah, my Corolla has never kicked me in the head.
You gotta pat its trunk when you walk behind it.
And don't make eye contact.
So I found this to be a pretty graphic sentence when he's writing about the condition of industrial workplaces in the 1800s. Whatever a machine can do to its materials, sawing, crushing, baking, stamping, threshing, or butchering them, it can also do to the workers tending it.
Wow.
He says the circus stuntman and test pilot of today enjoy greater life assurance than the railroad brakemen of yesterday whose work called for precarious leaps between bucking freight cars at the command of the locomotive's whistle.
Wow.
He says the 5,000 workplace deaths in the U.S. in 2005 are still far too many, but they are much fewer than the 20,000 of 1927 when the population of the country was 2/5 of what it is now.
Whoa.
And again, every tragedy is a tragedy, but there are fewer of them now. And I would also point out that the legal system helps out more people than it used to. Sometimes I think the pendulum has swung maybe too far the other way when it comes to lawsuits, but the fact is that if you lost your hand at work in the 1600s, your boss was like, gross, you're fired. But if you lost a hand now working at like Dave and Buster's, they would give you enough money to buy a mansion.
All right, lesson 4. This is all incredibly complicated, so beware of anyone who tells you it's not. I know some people who believe any government social spending is bad, And I know other people who believe anything capitalism does is bad. And I've seen in conversations when a new bad thing happens, how quickly they find a story to blame every bad thing on social spending or on capitalism. And what's funny is in those talks, they end up thinking I'm a complete anti-business socialist or a complete no regulations capitalist. And I'm not. I just think they're being crazy. And also with those people, it's almost like, you know, when a coworker has a terrible marriage, so they make that your problem. Like, oh, I get it. Communism forgot your birthday. Can we talk about anything else? So my point here is beware of anyone who tries to tell you how simple this is, how simple a world of 8 billion people is. So as one example, in this book, he argues poverty and hunger are going way, way down. Well, Jason Hickel has a book called The Divide where he points out the percentage of people in hunger and poverty are going down, but the number is staying about the same and by some measures going up. And his book, The Divide, is about all the ways that we're failing to do better. And I think it has a lot of very valid criticisms. Anyway, Kellen, isn't it crazy the world is so complicated that a book can be 400 pages, 1,200 citations, and someone can come and say, well, that really oversimplifies things.
Yeah.
Anyway, all this to say, nothing is simple and nothing is guaranteed, but have a good life. All right, random facts. This quote from an article Pinker wrote made me laugh. At the same time, progress does not mean that everything gets better for everyone everywhere all the time. That would not be progress. That would be a miracle. Progress is not a miracle. It's the result of solving problems.
So this isn't from the book. This is just from my own research. There are more Mission Impossible movies now than there ever have been in history. So now how badly do you want to go back to the 1700s?
He talks about how we've cut down on deaths from like gas poisoning or deadly falls. And then he says solving drug addiction is a different problem because, quote, people don't get addicted to carbon monoxide or crave taller and taller ladders. And wouldn't that be the funniest addiction? How would you hide that from your family? Oh, no, I just thought this skyscraper was on fire.
So he mentions that plane crashes always make the news, but car crashes, which cause far more fatalities, almost never do.
Yeah.
Not surprisingly, the fear of flying is super common, but not fear of driving. Like, have you ever met anyone who's like, I'm going to be late meeting you guys at Chili's. I'm going to walk because I don't get in cars. Not since I watched Mad Max. So in 2018, I had my appendix removed because me and him had a disagreement on whether or not he should burst. And after listening to this book and preparing this episode, I wrote a thank you note to the doctor who performed the surgery, thanking him for saving my life because that's what he did. I realized that it's crazy how much we take for granted that like life-saving surgeries are not only commonplace, but nowadays people actually complain about having to miss work because of them. Any other time in history, if my appendix burst, I would have doubled over, and then the next strongest guy in the tribe would have hit me with a club, and then he would be the new leader.
I love that you're the leader in this scenario.
That's what you took from that.
What do you think, Kellen, is the first technological marvel that humans after a couple decades would not take for granted?
I just don't think there is one because I see that with the fact that you can drive a car on super springy coils 4 times faster than a horse, just like an inexhaustible animal, and people still get bored. I think that within our lifetimes, there will be hotels on the moon and that there will be commercial space travel. And even then, we will go from Neil Armstrong and the wonder of looking at our pale blue dot through his window to a kid who's like, Mom, where's the iPad 53?
No cable.
The shelf life of surprise and gratitude for new technology is so quick.
We're on the moon still ignoring those signs to conserve towels. There was a time as kids we went on a Yellowstone trip. And anytime we went on a vacation, my dad would always tell us, hey, there's a million of us. Don't embarrass me. People already think we're weird. So we go to this hotel in Yellowstone and everyone's on their best behavior. We seem to make such a good impression on the staff. We come home from Yellowstone and there's a voicemail from the cops on our phone. And my mom's like, what would the cops be calling about? And my sister Cassie says, oh no, the note. Turns out my sister Jess, we had just barely seen the movie North by Northwest, and she had read some books that had a similar plot point. She writes on one of those notepads in the hotel, help, my dad is trying to kill me, and then takes away the top sheet, leaving an imprint of that message. And unfortunately, this happened on the same trip that someone spilled root beer and cleaned it up with a white towel. So this poor cleaning person finds that death threat note and a bloody towel, calls the cops. And to be clear, the cops did not come by. They just called. And here, my angry parents put a kid on the phone who says, oh, no, they're not trying to kill me. Like, what kind of due diligence is that?
Yeah. And how much more does it sound like a kid is in duress when they have to say something like, it's okay, that was root beer.
Anyway, I think she was grounded from thriller novels for like a year.
When I first listened to this book, I didn't realize that when he was talking about people who don't identify themselves with any religion, that there is sometimes called nuns, Nones.
Oh.
And I was so confused when he'd say stuff like, nuns don't necessarily believe in God, or there are significantly more nuns now in every country than ever before. And I was like, I never really noticed them anywhere.
I would love, in the way that a Jewish person can be secular, that now there are just secular nuns. They're like, oh yeah, I don't really believe in God, but I'm so about the lifestyle. Just living in a convent with your homies, being cruel to children. It's
Yeah, I'm not really practicing, but you can't deny this outfit goes with everything.
All right, this book could also be called Statistics About the World Getting Better, but How Good Could the World Be If I Have to Read Statistics?
This book could also be called, Sorry Your Bitcoin Dropped Again, but at least everyone in your family still has heads.
I think Enlightenment Now should be the first in a trilogy, followed by Renaissance Tomorrow and Dark Ages Forever. And I know we're not supposed to say Dark Ages, but who am I offending? I'm sorry, was your grandfather a knight? All right, to recap our favorite lessons from Enlightenment Now. 1, we don't talk enough about the stuff that doesn't happen. 2, there are big ways in which life in the world has gotten a lot better. 3, some progress is invisible. 4, this is all incredibly complicated, so beware of anyone who tells you it's not.
And 5, when you go out today, just don't wear anything that smells like wood. Those beavers.